let us listen to God's word in our reading, which is from Job chapter 12, verses 7 to 10. But ask the animals, and they will teach you, or the birds of the air, and they will tell you. Or speak to the earth, and it will teach you, or let the fish of the sea inform you. Which of all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In his hand is the life of every creature, and the breath of all mankind. And then reading from chapter 26, verses 11 to 14. The pillars of the heavens quake, aghast at his rebuke. By his power he churned up the sea. By his wisdom he cut Rahab to pieces. By his breath the skies became fair. His hand pierced the gliding serpent. And these are but the outer fringe of his works. How faint the whisper we hear of him. Who then can understand the thunder of his power? Thanks be to God.
As I mentioned earlier, we're delighted to welcome Valerie round to Liberton Kirk today from Christian Aid. Here at Liberton we have a long tradition, and our connection with Christian Aid goes back many years. Many will remember Christine Seaton, who was our Christian Aid representative for many decades, indeed I think possibly on from the very inception of Christian Aid in Scotland. She led on the publicity and house-to-house collections. So it's a pleasure to call on Vala to speak to us about the up-to-date work of Christian Aid.
Good morning again. I know that you have a strong history of support for the World Church and for Christian Aid here at Liberton, so let me take this opportunity to thank you for that. What I'm going to do this morning is give you a wee bit of an overview as to some of the work that we currently do around the world, but I'm going to start by letting you know how Christian Aid started. Christian Aid was born at the end of the Second World War, and we were started by a Church of Scotland minister, Reverend Lister, who was serving as an army chaplain in Germany. And at the end of the war, a German commanding officer approached Reverend Lister and said, look at how the German people are living, look at how the refugees in Europe are living. Is there anything the British government can do to help? So he duly passed that back up the chain of command, and the message which came back to him was very clear. That is far too politically difficult, forget about it. But he didn't forget about it. Instead, he wrote and made the same ask of the British and Irish churches. Will you help the German people? Will you support the refugees in Europe? It was a politically difficult ask. It was also a pastorally very difficult ask, because it asked a war-weary people really to do what Jesus had asked of them, to provide love and care and support for those who had until very recently been considered the enemy. But the churches took it on, and so Christian Aid was born in that belief that practical responses to human suffering should be unconditional. They should be freely offered without any form of coercion, but also recognising that costly reconciliation is at the very heart of our gospel. And Christian Aid, from that beginning, has grown to be the organisation that it is today, where we work in nearly 30 countries around the world, always working through local partners, because we believe that it is our partners, and more so the people in poverty that they represent, who best know what needs to change locally in order for people to lift themselves out of poverty. And we've got partners working on a variety of things within each country, so food, healthcare, clean water, but also on some of the more complicated issues, land rights, gender justice, trade justice, tax justice, climate justice. Huge amounts of work go on around the world. And our partner work is our long-term development work. That makes up the bulk of what we do, the stories that you'll see at Christian Aid Week, at Harvest, at Christmas. We also respond in times of emergencies, either through our own partners or through ACT Alliance partners. If an emergency happens in a country where we don't have our own partners, the ACT Alliance is the Global Action of Churches Together Union. And then there's our advocacy, our campaigns work. Because as an organisation rooted in our faith, rooted in our belief that poverty is not what God wants for this world, we don't exist to keep just dealing with the symptoms of poverty, a bit like the game we saw earlier on, but we're there to ask some of those harder, more fundamental questions. What has to change here so that everybody can have a fair shot? And that sort of biblical imperative for justice and that gospel bias to the poor is really what guides our work day in, day out. And that is why over the years we've taken part in the anti-apartheid campaign, we've lobbied for fair trade, for trade justice, tax justice. But our big campaign since 2007 has been climate justice. And that is because our partners from right around the world are telling us that climate change is making poverty permanent. I'm going to ask for the first slide to get shown if that's possible. This picture comes from Ethiopia. Now, Ethiopia is a country which, like many, has suffered the extremes of climate change. Extremes being longer, more prolonged periods of drought, often followed by flash flooding. Other parts of the country suffering wetter, more humid weather. And what you can see here is 3 people trying to dig under what was a river, looking for water because the drought has been there so long, so intractable, and the water supply has all but disappeared. Now, Ethiopia is a country where 60–70% plus of the people rely on rain-fed agriculture to make a living, or they rely on animal husbandry. So if there is no water supply, people cannot grow their foods, they cannot look after their animals. The pressure is then on them to leave, to migrate, to look for work and livelihoods elsewhere. And Christian Aid is desperate to support people, to keep them on their land. And in Ethiopia and in many other countries across Africa, Christian Aid has been putting in sand dams to trap water deep underground so that communities can draw on it when there are prolonged periods of drought. The next picture you will see is from a different part of Ethiopia where there has been wetter, more humid weather, and you can see that that has been perfect for desert locusts. Locusts which have ravaged the crops, and you can see one poor farmer there trying a futile attempt to keep them from his crop, but pushing another 8.5 million people further into food insecurity. And Christian Aid was able to respond, thanks to Scottish Government support, to do some spraying of crops to keep them safe, to try and target where eggs were, but also to give people food parcels and replacement seeds so that people could plant again. The next slide that you will see just shows what has left once a swarm of locusts come through the crops and people are salvaging what they can there in order to use it as animal feed. But those conditions, as the climate changes, are becoming increasingly commonplace: drought, flash flooding, hot, humid conditions. The next slide takes us to Southeast Asia and Bangladesh. Again, cyclones, not new to that part of the world, but happening much more regularly with much greater intensity. And for those in the low-lying coastal areas, that means the land flooding, but flooding with salt water. So people cannot grow crops the way they used to. So where the flooding is not too bad, Christian Aid would provide saline-resistant rice seeds, saline-resistant grass seeds, put in place projects where people plant their fruit and vegetables in movable bags which can be lifted onto higher ground. But for this community here where the land is actually flooded, we've put in a project where supporting the community to farm crabs. And by able to farm crabs, people can eat crabs, they can sell crabs, they can still stay on their land and make that viable. And part of this kind of work goes alongside our access to markets, making sure that people are able to sell into their own local market. So I'm sure you know about fair trade, where fair trade guarantees a minimum price for producers, irrespective of market fluctuations. But the things we buy here, things which are for the export market, are teas, coffees, jams, sugar. When people are dealing with crab or shrimp or milk, they have to sell locally because it's a perishable item. So Christian Aid would put in place basic refrigeration, hygiene certification, a wee bit of business training to enable communities to sell into their own market. And you'll see one of the crabs up close in the next picture. And one of my colleagues was able to visit a very similar project in India where it was milk the community were selling. And she asked one of the women there, "Has this project changed your life?" And the woman thought about it for a moment and she said, "No," she said, "but it has changed my daughter's life." She said, "Because I've now got an income, I can afford to keep my daughter at school, she will not get married young, so therefore she will have a different life experience from me." And that for me is very inspiring because I think for me it's that generational change that we're invested in, knowing that change doesn't always happen overnight and that communities are building resilience to help not only themselves the here and now, but for generations to come. Moving on now to Latin America and to Nicaragua. This is our partner Serpeshka, who were, hopefully still are, award-winning coffee producers. They had managed to eliminate the middleman in that they were refining all their own beans, they were selling their beans direct to market. Some of the community had been trained as baristas, but in the last few years they have really struggled because hotter, wetter weather has been damaging the coffee crop. And so they've had to diversify now to grow coffee and cocoa, so that we're trying to offset what they lose from their coffee harvest with cocoa. And you'll see one of the cocoa pods up close in the next picture. So across the world, people are having to adapt their lifestyles because of an increasingly erratic climate. And so climate change, climate justice, it will stay at the heart of what we do. I'm just going to give you one other example of our work, because we do other things other than climate. And this is just to pick up on what was the Christian Aid Week story from 3 or 4 years ago. If I could have the next slide, please. And this was about providing health services in Sierra Leone. Christian Aid was working with some of the poorest communities there. They had identified that there was no health service. Christian Aid could easily have built a health centre, that wouldn't have been that difficult, but our partners know that a health centre is much more than a building. And so we worked very closely with the local community, with the local government as well, set up a three-way partnership and said the community will help build the facility, Christian Aid will provide the money for that, but the local government have to take on staffing of that. They have to provide a trained medical professional, and they need to have it stocked with medicines. Without those two things, it's just a building. So we worked closely with the government. People were able to lobby because they were taxpayers and say that is what we expect as taxpayers, that is essential service. And we were able to build one. The next picture will show you the community building the health centre. The next job, though, was the community working with Christian Aid to make sure that people were empowered to come to it. Because what Christian Aid realised was that women were needing to go to health centres, especially when they were pregnant, and they weren't being allowed to go because either their mother-in-law or their husband was saying, no, you have to go to the traditional birth attendant. And so a huge amount of work went into that, and a lot of gender justice work with the community, which was quite illuminating, because what they did was they gave families a diary and said, I want you to write down every single thing you do for a week. And at the end of that week, it was very obvious that there was a disproportionate amount of work done by the women. And so they came together and talked about that, and actually men said, okay, we recognise that, we will take on some of the housework, we'll take on some of the childcare. We had the local pastor as well as the local imam outside the house washing dishes, modelling something very different in that community. The feedback from that was very positive. Families were happier, women were less tired, everybody was thriving. But the men said, we're happy to do this, but we're not happy to do it when our mothers come to visit. And that was very interesting, because the attitude from the older women was, I didn't raise a son to be a servant to a woman. And it was the mother-in-laws, therefore, who were preventing the women coming to the health service. So there had to be another layer of education done on top of that, where the mother-in-laws became involved. And then at the time where women needed to go and access healthcare, they were able to do so. So it just shows you that our partners are so skilled in some of this stuff that they're able to do that holistic work to make sure that a community is able to access the services that it needs. But all of this work and so much more is only made possible because people like yourself give and act and pray for our work year round. So thank you to you here at Liberton for everything that you have done and everything that you continue to do for Christian Aid, because it is very much appreciated. Thank you.